The Umayyad commander never saw the killing blow coming. He was too busy winning. What Duke Odo of Aquitaine pulled off at Toulouse in 721 was not a miracle. It was the most elegant operational deception of the early medieval world, and by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how he did it. In 721 AD, the Umayyad Caliphate controlled more territory than any empire since Rome. It had obliterated the Persian Empire in a single generation. It had swept across North Africa in a decade. It had torn through the Visigothic kingdom of Iberia in less than 3 years, a campaign so total and so rapid that historians still struggle to explain its speed. By the time the Umayyad governor of al-Andalus, al-Sam ibn Malik al-Kawani, turned his eyes north toward the Pyrenees, his forces had not suffered a single significant strategic defeat in over a century of continuous warfare. They were not an army of men with lucky streaks. They were a machine, a system, a force that had learned, adapted, and refined the art of conquest across 3 continents. And they were coming for Toulouse. The morning al-Sam's vanguard crested the Pyrenean passes and looked down into the green valleys of Aquitaine, not a single general in that army doubted what was about to happen. They had done this before. They had done this 50 times before, against enemies larger, better fortified, better supplied, more experienced, and more desperate than anything this minor Frankish province could throw at them. The dust rising from 100,000 boots had already decided the outcome, or so every rational calculation suggested. What those calculations could not account for was the man waiting for them behind those walls, and what he had already put into motion before the first Umayyad tent was pitched on the plains of Garonne. An empire that had never lost a war sent its greatest army across the mountains to destroy a single city. The city had no professional standing army, no allied kingdoms coming to its rescue, and walls that had not been seriously tested in 300 years. It should have fallen in days. It held for months, and then it struck back. Think about that for a moment. Duke Odo of Aquitaine was not a young man in 721. He had spent decades navigating the treacherous fault lines of early medieval European politics, balancing against the Franks to his north, the fading Visigoths to his south, and the various chieftains and lords who swore allegiance to Aquitaine on their best days and rated it on their worst. He was not a man who expected help to arrive when he needed it. He was a man who understood with absolute clarity that survival in his world meant being the only person in the room who had already thought 3 moves ahead. By the time al-Sam's army crossed the mountains, Odo had been preparing for exactly this moment for years, not hoping it wouldn't come, preparing for when it did. This video is not about a siege. It is about the strategy behind surviving one. By the end of it, you will understand why Toulouse became the first permanent check on the greatest military expansion in post-Roman history, not through walls, not through numbers, not through divine intervention, but through a form of operational deception so elegant that the Umayyad commander never saw the killing blow coming until it had already landed. Before we go any further, if you are the kind of person who wants the real story of history, the tactics, the terrain, the blood and dust and genius behind the legend, hit that subscribe button and join us here. Drop a comment below and tell me where you are watching from, because this story deserves to be told properly, and that is exactly what we are going to do. To understand what happened at Toulouse in 721, you have to understand what the Umayyad Caliphate actually was by that point, because the popular image most people carry of medieval Islamic expansion fundamentally understates what this force represented. We tend to imagine Arab armies as cavalry raiders, fast-moving tribal formations that swept across open desert and arid plains, and in the early conquests, there is truth in that picture. But by 721, the Umayyad military had evolved into something far more sophisticated. It had absorbed the engineering traditions of the Byzantine Empire, the logistical frameworks of the Persian Sassanid state, and the tactical flexibility of Berber and Arab warfare. What marched into Aquitaine was not a raiding party. It was a combined arms military system that had spent 100 years learning how to take cities. The conquest of Iberia 12 years earlier had demonstrated exactly how this machine operated. The Visigothic kingdom of Spain had seemed, from the outside, like a formidable obstacle. It had fortified cities, a trained aristocratic cavalry tradition, and the memory of having stopped the Huns at the Catalonian plains. None of that mattered when Tariq ibn Ziyad landed at Gibraltar in 711, with a force that operated with a kind of coordinated aggression the Visigoths had never encountered. The decisive battle at Guadalete lasted 3 days. The Visigothic king, Roderick, died on the field. Within 3 years, Toledo, Seville, Zaragoza, cities that had stood for centuries, had all fallen. The pace was so extraordinary that the Arab chroniclers recording it seemed almost as surprised as the people they were conquering. By 719, that same military apparatus, now led by Al-Sam ibn Malik al-Khalani, had pushed into Septimania, the coastal strip of what is now southern France, and had taken Narbonne. Narbonne, a Roman city with walls that had resisted everything the late empire and every subsequent migration could throw at them, fell to the Umayyad advance in a matter of months. From Narbonne, the road into the heart of Gaul was open. There was one significant obstacle between the Umayyad position and the rich agricultural heartland of the Frankish world. One city, one duke, Toulouse. To understand why Toulouse mattered so much, you need to look at a map. Toulouse sits at the point where the Garonne River makes its great eastward bend before flowing toward the Atlantic. Control Toulouse, and you control the entire western corridor into Gaul. You control the river traffic, the road networks, the grain supply of the region, and most importantly, you control the psychological momentum of the campaign. If Toulouse fell, there was nothing between the Umayyad advance and the Loire Valley. The Frankish mayors of the palace, the real power in the crumbling Merovingian world, would have to fight on ground of the Umayyads' choosing, far from their northern strongholds. The math was that simple. Which is why Al-Sam invested not just soldiers in this campaign, but everything the caliphate could spare. The force that assembled in Iberia through the winter and spring of 720 and 721 was enormous. Modern historians debate the exact numbers. Arabic sources speak of figures that require skepticism, and European chronicles typically exaggerate enemy strength for dramatic and theological effect. But the military consensus places the effective Umayyad force somewhere between 30,000 and 100,000 men, with the operational corps of heavy cavalry, siege engineers, and veteran infantry probably numbering between 40 and 60,000. For the era, for the terrain, for the target, this was not an army of conquest. This was an army of annihilation. Al-Sam was not coming to negotiate terms with Odo of Aquitaine. He was coming to end him. But here is where it gets interesting. Here is what almost every account of Toulouse 721 gets wrong. The popular narrative treats Odo as a reactive defender, a duke caught off guard, huddling behind his walls, praying for rescue. That narrative is wrong in almost every particular, and the evidence that dismantles it has been hiding in plain sight in the Frankish chronicles and the archaeological record for centuries. Odo was not reacting to Al-Sam. Al-Sam was reacting to Odo. The entire operational shape of the Umayyad siege, its methodical pace, its heavy investment in containment rather than rapid assault, its careful avoidance of the open countryside, all of it reflects the behavior of a commander who understood, perhaps too late, that the man he was besieging was more dangerous than the city he was besieging. Let us stop here and examine that claim properly, because it changes everything about how you understand this battle. Al-Sam was an experienced commander. He had been governing al-Andalus since 716. He had overseen the consolidation of Iberia, the subjugation of the remaining Visigothic resistance pockets, and the expansion into Septimonia. He was not an impetuous man. He planned his campaigns methodically and advanced only when his logistics were secure. His decision to invest Toulouse in a formal siege rather than attempting a rapid assault is typically interpreted as caution or confidence, the choice of a man so certain of eventual victory that he was willing to take his time. But look at the geography again. Look at the timing. Look at what Odo had been doing in the months before the Umayyad army arrived.
Odo had not spent those months fortifying his walls. He had spent them emptying the countryside. By the time al-Sam's cavalry scouts crossed the Pyrenees and fanned out across the Garonne basin to assess the ground, they found almost nothing. Villages abandoned, grain stores removed or burned, livestock driven north. The roads were clear, not because they were safe, but because there was nothing left on them worth stealing. Every movable resource, every horse, every stored harvest, every source of forage that could sustain a besieging army through the summer months had been systematically removed. Al-Sam arrived at the walls of Toulouse to find a city that had prepared to endure a long siege, and a countryside that had been stripped to deny him everything he needed to sustain one. This is the strategy that history has almost entirely overlooked. Odo understood, probably from speaking with Visigothic refugees who had watched the Iberian campaign, that the Umayyad military machine was extraordinarily effective on the move, but logistically vulnerable when anchored in place. A besieging army of 50,000 men needs enormous daily quantities of food, water, fodder for horses, timber for construction, and iron for repairs. If you strip the land bare before they arrive, you force them into a position where every day of the siege costs them more than it costs you. Odo did not plan to defeat the Umayyad army inside the walls. He planned to exhaust it outside them. But that was only the first layer of the trap. When the Umayyad vanguard crested the last ridge and the towers of Toulouse came into view, what they saw was exactly what they expected to see: a fortified city. Old Roman walls, thick but not recently rebuilt. A river on one side providing natural defense. A garrison that would fight, certainly, but that could not possibly stand against a sustained professional assault. The scouts reported back to al-Sam with confidence. The city was defensible, but not impregnable. The Duke was inside with his best forces. It would take time, but it would fall. What the scouts did not report, because they could not see it, because Odo had been extraordinarily careful, was that Odo himself was not inside Toulouse. Or rather, Odo was inside Toulouse, and then he was not. The precise moment of Odo's departure from the city is one of the most debated details in the scholarship on this battle. Some sources suggest he left before the siege lines were fully established. Others suggest he slipped out through the river approaches after the encirclement was complete. The Frankish chroniclers are maddeningly vague on this point, perhaps deliberately. The idea of a duke abandoning his city, even for strategic reasons, was not something medieval chroniclers felt comfortable presenting straightforwardly. But the operational outcome is not in dispute. When the decisive moment of the battle arrived, Odo was outside the walls at the head of a mobile cavalry force, and al-Sam had no idea he was there. To understand the siege itself, you need to feel what it was like to be inside Toulouse as the Umayyad army settled into its positions in the spring of 721. The city was built on Roman foundations: stone walls, a grid of interior streets, warehouses, a forum, a cathedral, the bones of a civilization that had been there for 7 centuries. It was not a small town. It had perhaps 8,000 to 12,000 inhabitants, a significant urban population for early medieval Gaul, supported by the agricultural wealth of the Garonne basin. But those inhabitants were about to experience something that none of them, not even the oldest among them who remembered the Visigothic wars, had experienced before. A professional siege conducted by an army that had made the reduction of cities into a science. The Umayyad siege engineers were the finest in the Western world at that moment. They had inherited the traditions of Persian, Byzantine, and Arab military engineering, and they had refined those traditions across a decade of continuous campaigning in Iberia. They brought with them trebuchets, counterweight siege engines capable of hurling stones of 200 pounds or more with accuracy enough to strike specific sections of wall repeatedly until the stonework gave way. They brought mantlets and siege towers, covered assault vehicles that could advance infantry to the base of walls while protecting them from defender fire. They brought ladders and grappling equipment, and they brought something more psychologically devastating than any physical weapon. The knowledge, shared by everyone on both sides of those walls, that this army had never failed to take a city it had committed to taking. The encirclement of Toulouse was methodical. Al-Sam did not rush. He understood that a city stripped of outside supply would eventually run out of food, regardless of the courage of its defenders. He established his main camp to the north and east of the city, where the ground was flat and suitable for his heavy siege equipment. He positioned cavalry screens along every road and river approach, blocking not just resupply, but any intelligence Odo might attempt to send to potential allies in the Frankish north. He built watchtowers on the surrounding ridges. He dug trenches and raised earthworks that transformed the open plain into a structured killing ground. He brought timber from the forests of the Pyrenean foothills, transported north by pack train, to build the covered siege platforms that would allow his engineers to work within arrow range of the walls. Within 2 weeks of arriving at Toulouse, he had constructed, in effect, a second city outside the first. A city of tents and timber, of forges and supply wagons, of engineers and cavalry, and the massed weight of the most powerful military force in the Western world. Inside the walls, the garrison did what garrisons do. They rationed food and water. They repaired damage from the first probing attacks. They took turns on the ramparts in rotating watches, sleeping in snatches, eating less each week than the week before. They sent prayers upward and hopes outward, and tried not to think too carefully about what was happening just beyond the range of their archers. The population of the city, the families, the merchants, the priests and farmers and craftsmen who could not fight, lived in a kind of suspended time, waiting. The children noticed it first, the way the adults stopped laughing, the way conversations ended when they entered rooms, the way the city had grown both louder with the sounds of siege and quieter with the sounds of normal life.
The first serious assault came in the 3rd week. It was not intended to breach the walls, not yet. It was an exercise in psychological warfare, a demonstration of capability designed to make the garrison understand the futility of continued resistance. 3 trebuchets opened fire against the northern gate complex simultaneously, maintaining a rhythm of 1 heavy strike every 4 minutes throughout an entire day. The stones, some of them dressed blocks weighing nearly a quarter ton, salvaged from Roman quarry sites north of the city, struck the wall with concussive impacts that residents felt in their chests from a kilometer away. Cracks appeared in sections of the upper curtain wall. Dust fell from the gate arch in a continuous gentle stream. By evening, a section of parapet on the east side of the gate had collapsed inward, opening a gap in the defender walkway that required emergency repair through the night. They repaired it, they always repaired it, but now both sides understood something that had not been explicitly stated before. The walls would not hold indefinitely. The question was not whether the Umayyads could break them. The question was whether they could break them before something changed outside the walls, before help arrived, before Odo came back, before whatever Odo had planned began to unfold. This is where the story turns dark. Because what Odo had set in motion, the careful positioning of a mobile cavalry force in the forested hills north and west of the siege lines, required an act of faith that most commanders in his position would have been unable to sustain. He had left his city, his people, his walls, in the hands of a garrison that could not be reinforced and could not receive new orders as conditions changed. The coordination problem was immense. His mobile force needed to strike at precisely the moment of maximum Umayyad commitment to the assault, not too early when the besiegers would still have reserves easily available, and not too late when the walls might already be breached. In modern military terms, Odo was attempting to operate inside his enemy's decision cycle while maintaining operational security so complete that his own forces inside the city did not know the exact details of the plan. It is almost certain that Odo had established sent pre-arranged signals before his departure, a pattern of torches on a specific tower, the behavior of the garrison at a specific gate, something that could communicate across the distance between the walls and the hillside observation points without requiring a messenger who could be captured. Exactly what that signal was, the chronicles do not say. What they tell us is that when the moment came, both forces moved together. Odo's mobile force was not improvised. It was not the desperate last reserve of a losing commander. It was the operational arm of a strategy Odo had been constructing for months before the siege began. Understanding this requires understanding something about how Aquitanian military power actually worked in the early 8th century, not the romantic image of medieval lords and levied peasants marching under banners, but the practical reality of how a frontier duchy mobilized and sustained fighting power. Odo had spent a decade building relationships with the Gascon chieftains to his southwest, men who commanded the fast-moving, difficult-to-catch cavalry that had made the Pyrenean passes ungovernable for everyone who had tried to govern them for 300 years. The Gascons were not a standing army in any formal sense. They were a warrior culture, organized around kinship and local loyalty, expert riders in terrain that would founder conventional cavalry, accustomed to operating in small independent groups that could move faster and more quietly than any organized force of comparable size. They were, in modern terms, light cavalry specialists, the kind of fighters who could move a force of several thousand men through forested hill country at night without being detected by the cavalry screens of an alert professional besieging army. That last capability was not incidental to Odo's plan. It was the plan. The Umayyad siege doctrine assumed a three-dimensional operational environment: the city in front, the open plain behind, and the screened approaches on the flanks. It screened the roads because roads were where relief armies moved. It watched the river because rivers were where boats moved. What it did not adequately screen, because the terrain made movement there seem impossible, were the forested ridgelines to the northwest, where the hills curled around behind the western flank of the camp in a series of broken ravines and dense oak stands that any cavalry commander trained in open terrain would look at once and dismiss. The Gascons looked at the same ground and saw a road. History remembers what happened next. What it forgets is why it was even possible. The night before the counterattack, the Umayyad camp was operating in the full confidence of an army that had broken its enemy to the edge of collapse. The trebuchet bombardment had been intensifying for days. A section of the northern wall had developed a crack that the engineers assessed as potentially catastrophic within the next week of sustained fire. The garrison, visible through tactical observation posts that the Umayyad engineers had positioned throughout the siege works, was visibly exhausted. Fewer defenders on the ramparts during daylight, slower responses to probing attacks at the gates, the behavioral signatures of a force that was running out of human reserves even faster than it was running out of food. Al-Sam had ordered the final bombardment phase to begin at dawn. All 7 remaining operational trebuchets would concentrate fire on the northern gate complex for 6 consecutive hours. After that, if the wall section gave way as calculated, the assault teams would go in behind the covered mantelets. The engineers estimated a 40% probability that the gate complex would be reduced enough for a viable breach assault by midday. They had done this before, many times. The numbers were reliable. What the numbers could not capture was what was moving through the forests above the western camp that night. In silence, in darkness, in terrain the cavalry screens had stopped actively patrolling 3 weeks into the siege, when nothing had appeared there and the horses needed rest.
Shift your perspective entirely. You are a Gascon rider in Odo's mobile force. It is 2 hours before dawn. You have been moving through these hills for 4 nights, sleeping in forest cover by day, advancing incrementally toward the observation point where, the night before last, you could see the Umayyad camp in its entirety laid out below you in the valley. You are cold. You are hungry. You have not spoken above a whisper in days. Your horse has had its hooves wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound on rocky ground. You carry a short lance and a hand axe and a knife, and you know that what you are about to do, charge downhill at full speed into a camp of 50,000 soldiers, is either one of the most tactically brilliant operations in the history of medieval warfare or the most catastrophically suicidal mistake you have ever made. Duke Odo is visible somewhere in the darkness ahead of you. You cannot see him, but you know he is there because the riders around you are following a direction, a heading, a sense of forward purpose that could only be coming from someone who knows where he is going. Then, from the direction of the city, something flickers. A specific arrangement of torches on the northern tower. Brief, deliberate, gone in seconds. Around you, the quiet word travels back through the ranks in a whisper so soft it barely disturbs the forest silence. Now. The Umayyad camp was struck before the men inside it understood what was happening. Not with noise at first, with a vibration. The sound of several thousand horses moving through rock and earth carries through the ground before it carries through the air, and the first awareness that something was wrong arrived at the boots and legs of the sentries on the western camp perimeter before it reached their ears. By then, it was too late. The initial Gascon wave struck the supply depot and the siege engine positions, not the combat lines, not the heavy infantry who could form up and receive a charge, but the soft center of the camp, where the engineers slept beside their machines, and the quartermasters managed the food stores, and the smiths kept their forges cold at night. These were not soldiers in the tactical sense. They were the technical and logistical support that made the siege possible. Killing them did not destroy the army. Destroying their equipment and burning their supplies did something far more damaging. It destroyed the timeline. A siege is a race against time even when it appears to be a slow grind of attrition. The besieging army is consuming resources every day, food, materials, the operational life of its equipment, and the only justification for those costs is that the city will fall before the costs become unsustainable. Al-Sam had calculated his supply margin carefully. He had brought enough to sustain the siege through the summer. What he had not calculated was a scenario where his siege engines were burning and his supply wagons were on fire and his engineering staff were dead or running before a single assault on the walls had succeeded. The second Gascon wave hit the command area. This is where the chronicles become most contested because this is where Al-Sam's fate is recorded and the accounts differ. One tradition holds that he was killed in the initial cavalry charge, struck down before he could mount a horse and reach the combat lines. Another holds that he was mortally wounded while attempting to rally his officers, dying within days of the battle. A third, less reliable account suggests he survived the engagement and was killed in the subsequent retreat. What all accounts agree on is that at the moment of maximum crisis, when the Umayyad command structure most needed its center to hold, the center was gone. An army without its commander in a sudden crisis does not immediately collapse. It does something more complex and ultimately more fatal. It fragments. Different officers make different assessments of the situation. Some order counterattack, some order defensive formation, some order retreat. In the resulting confusion, the orders cancel each other out and the army executes none of them effectively. The veteran infantry who could have formed a disciplined defensive line received 3 contradictory orders in the space of 20 minutes and stood in formation while the chaos around them intensified, waiting for clear direction that never came. From the walls of Toulouse, the garrison was watching, and what they saw, the fires, the confusion, the unmistakable behavioral signature of an army losing its command coherence was understood by every veteran soldier on those ramparts within minutes of its beginning. The garrison commander made the call that the moment required. The gate opened. Not the main northern gate, which faced the bulk of the siege works, but a secondary gate on the riverside, where the siege lines were thinner and the defenders had been studying the patterns of the Umayyad perimeter watch for weeks. A controlled mounted force came out at speed, not the full garrison, the walls still needed defending, but enough to press the front of the siege works at the precise moment when the rear was being torn apart by the Gascon cavalry. A force pressed from 2 directions simultaneously does not double its resistance, it halves it. The psychology of encirclement, even partial encirclement, even the perception of encirclement, produces a qualitatively different response than simple frontal pressure. Men who might hold their position against a force attacking from one direction will break against a force attacking from two, because the fundamental calculation of survival changes. Fighting through a single enemy offers an exit. Fighting through two enemies simultaneously offers only the possibility of being caught between them. The Umayyad soldiers were not cowards. They were not poorly trained or badly equipped. Many of them had fought in Iberia and North Africa and across the most demanding terrain in the known world, but they were experiencing something their training had not prepared them for: the collapse of the operational framework that made their strength coherent. A trebuchet crew without its machines is just a group of men. A cavalry screen without its command structure is just riders. An infantry assault force without its engineers and its supply chain is a formation that cannot sustain the pressure it needs to breach a wall.
The retreat did not begin all at once. It never does. It begins in the parts of the force farthest from the fighting, where men can see the flames and hear the confusion, but cannot see what to do about it, and where the rational calculation of danger and distance begins to favor movement over standing still. From the farthest supply positions, it spread to the rear support elements, then to the screening cavalry, then to the siege line infantry, until the movement that had begun as a trickle became a current running through the whole force, and the current became the unmistakable and irreversible flow of an army choosing to leave. Odo did not pursue hard. He had the sense, or the exhaustion, or the strategic clarity to understand that pursuit was not what the moment required. The Gascon cavalry shadowed the retreating force at distance, gathering abandoned equipment and horses, blocking any attempt to rally and reform, but not closing for the kind of decisive engagement that would force a desperate army to turn and fight. A force allowed to retreat intact retreats. A force cornered during retreat fights with the ferocity of men who have nothing left to lose. Odo needed the Umayyad army to leave. He did not need to destroy it. The plains outside Toulouse, when the sun finally climbed fully above the horizon, presented one of the most extraordinary scenes in early medieval military history. The siege camp, which had been, 24 hours earlier, the most formidable military installation between the Pyrenees and the Loire, was largely empty. The trebuchets stood where they had been positioned, their counterweights lowered, their throwing arms motionless, too large and too heavy to take away in a disorganized retreat. The supply wagons stood in their positions with their loads partially intact. The engineering stockpiles, timber, iron fittings, stone blocks shaped for the siege engines, the accumulated technical capacity of months of preparation were simply left. The trenches and earthworks remained. The watchtowers remained. Everything that had been built to reduce Toulouse over months stood abandoned, silent, and intact. And the city was still standing. The garrison came out slowly, not in the sudden rush of soldiers freed from a siege, but carefully, warily, in the way of people who have learned not to believe in sudden good news until the evidence is overwhelming. They walked through the abandoned camp and looked at the trebuchets and the supply stores and the engineering works and began to understand what had happened. Around them, the Gascon riders were arriving from the hills, tired, dust-covered, leading captured horses that showed the signs of hard nights in rough country. The real Odo, visible through the layers of hagiography, was probably a very tired man sitting on a very tired horse in the ruins of a siege camp that had been the most powerful military installation in the Western world 3 days earlier. He had been planning this moment for years. He had executed it with a precision that even 13 centuries later retains the quality of genuine military genius. And now it was done, and the men around him were alive who might easily have been dead, and the city behind him was standing that might easily have been rubble. The aftermath of Toulouse unfolded across the following weeks and months in ways that the battle itself could only suggest. The Umayyad force retreated south toward Narbonne in fragments, regrouping as it went, bleeding men and equipment the entire way. The chronicles do not give reliable figures for casualties, but the operational reality was clear. The force that limped back into Iberia was not capable of resuming the offensive that year. It needed time, new leadership, new supplies, new siege equipment to replace what had been abandoned on the plains of Garonne.
That time, that specific interval between the defeat at Toulouse and the reorganization of Umayyad offensive power in the region, was not empty. It was filled with consequences that shaped the next decade of European history. In the Frankish kingdoms, the news traveled with a speed that genuinely important military news always traveled in the medieval world. Fast, distorted, but recognizable in its essential truth. The city had held, the duke had counterattacked, the army that had seemed unstoppable had retreated. Charles Martel, consolidating his power in the north, received this intelligence and understood what it meant. He had more time than he had feared. Not unlimited time, the Umayyad expansion would resume, and everyone paying attention knew it, but enough time to prepare, to organize, to study the operational patterns that Odo's campaign had revealed. The Battle of Tours in 732, the engagement that Gibbon immortalized and that most educated people know as the decisive check on the Umayyad expansion, is best understood as the culmination of a process that began at Toulouse 11 years earlier. Charles Martel fought at Tours with knowledge that no Frankish commander had possessed before Toulouse, knowledge of Umayyad operational vulnerabilities, knowledge of how their siege doctrine worked and where it failed, knowledge that the terrain of Gaul, its rivers and forests, and the particular character of its agricultural landscape could be used to constrain and exhaust a force that had been designed for more open warfare. He also fought with time that Toulouse had bought. This is the argument that military historians who specialize in this period have been making for decades, in journals and conference proceedings that almost nobody outside the field reads. The popular history of early medieval Europe treats Tours as the decisive moment, the hinge point, the battle that determined whether Europe would be Christian or Muslim. That framing is itself a simplification, but even within its own terms, it misidentifies the critical moment. The critical moment was not 732. It was 721. It was the decision made in the months before Al-Sam crossed the Pyrenees to strip the land and hide the cavalry, and let the city absorb the siege, while the real blow was being prepared outside the lines.
Tours gets the fame because it was bigger and more decisive in the immediate tactical sense, and because Charles Martel is a more prominent historical figure than Odo of Aquitaine. Toulouse gets almost nothing, because Odo is one of those figures who appear in the chronicles as supporting characters in other people's stories, never quite large enough in the records to dominate a narrative on their own terms. But let the battle speak for itself. In 721, the most powerful military force in the Western world besieged a city with every intention of reducing it within weeks. 3 months later, it was retreating in disorder, without its commander, without its siege equipment, without the operational momentum it had arrived with. The force that Odo assembled and the strategy he executed produced an outcome that the pure mathematics of the engagement, the ratio of forces, the quality of equipment, the professional experience on each side, would have assessed as essentially impossible before it happened. The last thing that needs to be said about Toulouse 721 is about al-Sam himself, because military history has a tendency to flatten its defeated commanders into cautionary figures who exist to demonstrate what the winners did right. Al-Sam was not a failure. He was an excellent commander who was defeated by a more subtle adversary operating in terrain and against a population that did not conform to the patterns his experience had taught him to expect. His crime, if it can be called that, was the crime of success. He had won so many times in so many different conditions that he had stopped fully accounting for the specific variables of each new situation. History is full of commanders like this, men who were excellent practitioners of a proven system, destroyed not by incompetence, but by the encounter with someone who had thought more carefully about the gap between the general rule and the specific case. At Toulouse, Odo was the innovator, and al-Sam was the general who had all the advantages and still lost because he had not found the question that the battle was really asking. The question was this: when your enemy strips the land before you arrive, hides his best force outside your lines, and allows his city to absorb your siege rather than expecting rescue, what exactly are you besieging? You are besieging the visible part of a strategy that is simultaneously working against you from directions you cannot see. And by the time you understand that, it is already too late to do anything about it. The people who held Toulouse were not soldiers, or rather they were not only soldiers. They were a city. They were the families who hauled stones to the ramparts and boiled pitch in kettles they normally used for rendering fat. They were the women who kept the water moving and the wounded treated and the children calm enough to sleep. They were the priests who maintained the rhythm of liturgical time so that the weeks of siege did not dissolve into undifferentiated panic. They were the merchants who calculated the food stores and the craftsmen who repaired the equipment and the farmers who had already stripped their own fields and driven their own livestock away before the enemy arrived, understanding that this sacrifice was their contribution to the defense. A siege is a test of a community's ability to remain a community under conditions designed to make community impossible. The Umayyad siege doctrine was not accidental in its comprehensiveness. It was designed not just to breach walls, but to break the social fabric of the defended population, to make the ordinary mechanics of human solidarity too costly to sustain. Toulouse did not give them that. Not in 3 months, not after the walls cracked and the trebuchet stones fell through the night and the food ran lower each week. The city held not because its walls were stronger than other walls, but because Odo had done something rare and difficult in the months before the siege began. He had given his people agency over their own fate, rather than making them passive objects of larger forces. Agency in a siege is everything. The walls of Toulouse still stand in places. Not the walls that Odo defended, those were rebuilt, extended, and eventually absorbed into later medieval fortifications and then into the modern city. But the Roman substrate beneath them, the old foundation courses that the Umayyad trebuchet stones cracked and split, those are still there, buried under 13 centuries of subsequent history. Odo of Aquitaine died around 735, outliving al-Sam by 14 years. He lived long enough to see the Umayyad expansion checked again at Tours by a man who had the benefit of everything Toulouse had taught. He is buried, according to tradition, somewhere in Gascony, in the hills south of the city he saved. The monastery is gone. The hills remain. The empire that seemed unstoppable was stopped. Not by walls, not by numbers, not by divine favor, though the chroniclers insisted on it, by the particular intelligence of one man who understood that the most dangerous weapon against a certain kind of power is the patient, deliberate refusal to be where it expects you to be, and the quiet, methodical preparation of the blow it never sees coming. That is what happened at Toulouse. That is what history forgot to remember.